I'm really glad to see all of you here. I was really happy that the keynote this morning was so energetic. All of us, I'm sure, went out, had a lot of fun last night, and so having people to get here and wake us up and get us really excited about the day is great, and it's a great thing to follow. I'm Julia Wester. I'm the co-founder of a small two-person consulting company in Seattle, Washington, so the U.S., and I'm here today to talk about defending against CDD, or chaos-driven delivery. Now, I know many of you have heard about BDD and TDD, but you've probably never heard about CDD, except you've likely experienced it. Now, before I start, I want to make sure that people are clear. I'm not talking about chaos engineering, right? There are, I'd say, almost curated, contained levels of chaos that can be really quite productive in our organizations. And so that's not what we're talking about today. What I'm talking about today is the kind of chaos that leaves your head spinning, you're making bad decisions, but you don't even have time to realize you're making bad decisions or do anything about it, even if you did. So that's what we're here to try to find some ways to defend against. So how many of you feel like this represents a good day at work? Or a bad day, maybe? I don't know. How many of you are in ops? Okay. I'm surprised I didn't see more of your hands go up. It seems like every organization that I've worked in, the ops teams are just getting pummeled and feeling like their job is firefighter. That's their number one job. And then maybe around 4 o'clock, they can start on the work they were supposed to do had the fires not started, right? And that's what we want to try to get a little handle around. Okay. A lot of the times when this happens, it's because we are catering to the whims of the loudest voice in the room for what to do, or the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, right? And we don't really have good ways to manage and schedule the work that we're doing. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But first, I want to challenge this myth of multitasking. And I know this is sort of cliche at this point to challenge it, but people still think that they are excellent multitaskers. In fact, if I do a workshop and I ask, there's always a couple of people that say, no, I know what you mean, but I can do it, right? But what they're thinking is that they can look at these, they can have 3 tasks going on, and they think they're actively making progress on all 3 at exactly the same millisecond, right? They think that it's happening in parallel. And they'll say, look, I'm doing 2 things at once. I'm an excellent multitasker. But what's really happening is more likely than not, they're listening to music or doing something like that. And then they're doing something else like coding that takes a lot of effort and thought, okay? Now, who can tell me how it's possible to listen to music and do things like coding that take a lot of thought? Why is it possible to do this? Anybody have an idea? Yes? Yeah, one of them is unconsciously, right? You don't have to use your brain to listen to music. It's happening in the background. It's a background process, right? And if you were in Paul's talk last night, it's the system 1 kind of thinking. There's a lot of things that happen. I know when I've driven home on certain days, we have these high occupancy vehicle lanes, and they require 2 people in a car. Well, I've been on my way home and realized that I just drove through a high occupancy vehicle lane without my, carpool partner in the car, without even realizing it, because it was muscle memory. It's not something I actively thought about. It just happened. So these are the things that we say we're doing when we say we're multitasking. But really, it's usually a background process and something more in the foreground that's taking our thought. When we say we're trying to multitask between 2 brain-consuming things, what we're doing is rapidly task switching. So you can see this more clearly in this visual. So task 1 does a little bit of work. Then we do task 2 a little bit, task 3 a little bit, right? So we're feeling like, depending on how fast our little cycles are, we're feeling like we're doing all of this at once. But in reality, our failure to prioritize the thing that we want to do the most is causing each one of them to take a little bit longer. Sometimes that's a good choice, sometimes it's not. So we'll talk about that just a little bit. But what happens if we continue to let the water pipe, the water hose of work just funnel in unfettered, and we continue to believe in this fallacy of multitasking, that we can be excellent multitaskers, we end up in this vicious cycle of pain, right? We have the hippo yelling out, do this, no, do this, regardless of all of this other stuff that's going on that might actually be more important, or the loudest voice in the room. So we have that happening, and we react to that. And that causes us to be overwhelmed with the amount of things that are going on, because we're not, no one is saying no to anyone yet. And then because that doesn't work out for us, it causes us to escalate things, right? And then escalations lead to the person yelling again and the highest paid person having an opinion again and all of those things. So it really is a self-fulfilling prophecy, a vicious cycle of bad behavior. So we need to figure out a way to stop this from going on. And I had a thought. I was like, I'm talking to people who are very technical and they're working with computers, and there are lots of things that they already know about managing work that maybe they're just not really thinking about. They're not pulling it, extracting it from the things that they're already doing and knowing about and applying it to how they manage their work. So I said, well, let's talk about that a little bit. And so this is where the operating system comes in. Okay? Now, process management, process scheduling, process synchronization, they're all integral parts of an operating system. Okay. Someone has sat down and said, encoded this operating system to use these policies to affect it and make it work in a certain way. So if we can sit down and write policies and schedulers and synchronizers and all this thing for an operating system that is doing jobs, well, we can do that same thing for ourselves as well. So the interesting thing is that we say, well, it's hard for us to come up with policies that help us, do what we really need to do because we're special, right? We have things coming in randomly at unknown times. Our jobs are all different sizes. And I'm like, well, so does the operating system, right? It's not like it can just sit back and say, nope, that's too big, and, you have a scheduled time, you can request this at 3:30 or something like that. That's not how it works. So we can, the metaphor will go a certain depth, but we can look at that and take some of those concepts away and figure out how we can apply them in our desire to get our work done in an effective way. So what I want to do is I want to start out with some simple scheduling algorithms. These are not necessarily what's in place in our complex operating systems today. We'll get to that. But these are the core components that are used in those more complex systems. Okay? So let's start with first come, first served. Right? This is something few of us rarely do. Does anyone in here process their work in a first come, first served kind of situation? Right, because life is a little more complex than that. It's really good for homogeneous work, or if you can do your work quickly enough, then maybe you can do your work in a first come, first served manner because you do it so quickly, people don't have time to complain about it. They don't feel the weight. So one of the things that's interesting about DevOps and worrying about how quickly and effectively we can get work to flow from a point over here on the left somewhere all the way through to the hands of the customers, the more effectively we do that and remove bottlenecks and care about flow, the more likely we are to be able to get to the capability of doing a first come, first serve situation. And what I find interesting, for if you don't realize it yet, first come, first serve is often used synonymously with FIFO, or first in, first out, but there is a difference, right? So you have a couple of options here. You can say first come, first served. That's how it starts. It gets into the system. I'll start you on the order in which you got here. First in, first out means that order takes priority all the way through the working time of that. The thing that came in second does not get out before the thing that started first does, right? The first thing is always the most important. So a couple of interesting things. So deadlines can be met by giving processes with deadlines a higher priority and getting them into the system first. But once they're in, they're sort of processed in a first come, first serve. Okay, so shortest job first. This is another simple way of managing how we want to do our work. And it is sort of like what it sounds. The thing that will take the least amount of time will get a priority over the things that take a long amount of time. But there's a bit of an issue with that. I don't know about you, but I've seen very few people that are really good at figuring out how long it's going to take to do our work, right? And so our inability to know that information very clearly is what makes this sort of hard to do. Okay? We lack enough info sometimes to establish the duration, and even when we do know some info, we're bad at the estimation until we start doing things like forecasting using probabilities to get a little bit better at that, but a lot of us just aren't there yet. Now, in the shortest job first, if you start a piece of work and then something shorter comes in, that could be preempted with the new shortest job. So that's a choice you can make with how you're scheduling your work. Now, the thing about shortest job first is we start to experience this phenomenon called job starvation, right? That's when, if I have a bunch of short jobs, my medium size and big jobs are never going to get done. Those jobs will just sit there and languish and fester. Okay. Then we move to something that we're all familiar with, priority. Okay. Now, this doesn't yet go into how the priority is decided. There's a million ways you can decide which job has priority over another. But scheduling by priority means that the highest priority thing goes first. Oftentimes you end up with buckets. We'll talk about that in a second. Unless you're stack ranking each individual request one after the other, then you can work in a scheduling by priority kind of thing. But again, just like the shortest job first, we have the issue where we might have job starvation. Because if you continually have high priority things injected into your system, then the medium and the low priority things will never get done. Now, that may or may not be a problem. Maybe you're saying, well, if they're low priority, who cares, right? Maybe they shouldn't be done. But it's something to consider that if you're working purely in a priority standpoint and you're not doing a good enough job in handling how the things get prioritized, then you could be in a situation where the work that you're doing, some of it will never get done. Anybody have an example for me of things that never get done in your organization? What kind of updates? OS updates, perfect, right? I've experienced that too, where, no one is going to make time for the thing that's low priority, but after a while it becomes excessively high priority, becomes an emergency, interrupts everything else, causes chaos. So our starving some of these low priority jobs eventually creates future emergencies. So it's something that we want to think about, even if, right now we're thinking that's low priority. Eventually, it may not be. Okay, the last simple kind of scheduling process I want to go over is a round robin. Okay, and I know all of these are pretty familiar to you, but just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So this is where you're working on each of your jobs. You've got them in some sort of order, maybe first come, first served, in a list. And you're saying, okay, I'm going to do a little bit of each one. This is that rapid task switching. Okay, so I'll do a little bit of job A, then I'll move to a little bit of job B, a little bit of job C. Now, the great part about that is everyone feels good at the beginning because you're starting. Starting feels amazing. But what happens is, after a while, you really don't start finishing things. And so that early feeling of awesomeness becomes, anger and, dissatisfaction with your organization because you're taking forever to get something done. Okay. So this is really good for an average response time kind of thing, but not really good for cycle time results. So there are 3 top side effects of any scheduling method that you choose, and we want to be a little aware of what those things are. Okay. The first is that job starvation again. Each method that we talked about, except the round robin, is going to, except the round robin and the first come, first served, is going to mean that some work gets ignored. Okay? And that's not often very acceptable. The second is one that we haven't talked about yet, is that anytime we're not doing the simplest option, which is first come, first serve, we're injecting the need to create management overhead, to decide what the priority is, to decide what's the shortest job, and that kind of thing. And, I like to say that let's do the simplest thing that gets results. Because what happens over time is you look at the cycle time of a project or a product or anything that you're doing, and it ends up where all of this management overhead takes so long where if you had just started it, you could get it done. So we do want to be very careful about how much management overhead we inject into the process and always be asking ourselves, are we ready to make it simpler? What would have to be done to reduce the need for all of these extra levels of prioritization or sizing? How would we have to operate not to need that? And then context switching. Going back to the rapid task switching, this is where we meet this guy here. And I like this chart from the Quality Software and Management Systems Thinking book. Okay, so if you want to know where this came from, that's where it came from. And it's showing here pretty clearly that if you do one thing at a time, obviously you're going to spend all of your time on that and we'll finish faster. For each extra thing that we start, the context switching cost of that increases. And by the time we get to the point where we're doing multiple, 5 things at once, the majority of our time is spent managing, reaping costs of switching in between, and very little of it is actually getting things done. Sort of feels like my house mortgage, where most of my payment is interest, and very little of it is actually paying off the principal of my house. So this is something that we really need to consider, and the more we try to do, the less we try to control how much is going on at once, the more and more and more of the time we spend is going to be handling that overhead and that context switching cost. I do want to, when we're thinking of this metaphor of looking at how operating systems work and figuring out how we can pull some of those things, extrapolate them, and inject them into decisions about how we manage our work, we do have to be cognizant of one thing, that the time scales are very different. So while it might be possible for an operating system to effectively use a round-robin sort of scheduling, it's moving extremely quickly. Its jobs don't take weeks or months or days, right? Hopefully. Some of them might, but not most of what a person sits down at a computer to do. So because the jobs are very, very tiny, when we amplify those, when we take those and take the stuff and apply it to the jobs that we do, which are much longer, all of the negative bits and pieces are amplified, and they become exponentially bigger issues than what we're seeing when they're in the computers, in the operating system. So there are no really perfect methods out of those simple scheduling methods. Not one is really going to meet all of our needs. So when we're in a situation where we can't remove the risk entirely, then what we want to do is figure out ways to reduce that risk. Okay? So one of the things that we want to look at is looking at each method and figuring out how to take the bits and pieces of each one, blend them together, and make something that does work for us. Now, we're hearing that a lot in this conference, and I hope you hear it a lot everywhere, that you can't just take something from one place and apply it to another and expect it to work out for you. Now, there are some really good practices, and for things that are really obvious, maybe even some best practices. But it's usually better to take your context, take the learnings from someone else's success, and figure out what might work for you. This is where we get to the more complex process scheduling methods. These are the things that are actually being used in the operating systems that we use today, because they realize that those simple methods just aren't going to cut it. Okay? So we get to the concept of a multi-level queue. So this is a bit like your class of service. So we have queue number 1, and it's the most important. This is the high priority bucket of work. So these buckets, these queues are like priority queues in a way. And each one has a different definition of what it is, and you can decide which queue to put it in based on that definition. When I was at Turner Broadcasting Systems and I worked on CNN.com, we had a queuing system for all of our syndication. So when we published the homepage or when we published an article, all of these secondary things were happening. We were taking payloads and injecting them into different queues. So the first queue that got run was the breaking news queue. And that took precedence over everything else that was happening, so that thing could go out instantaneously. Okay? Nothing else but breaking news information got put into that queue so that nothing else would preempt it, right? Then we get to the section fronts and getting those updated. That was in queue number 2. So when you publish a story, the next thing that happened would be it would show up on the different section fronts. Then we would get to our syndication. And at that point, we could start sending out jobs for YouTube, for all of the partners that are taking feeds from CNN and throwing that out there. So we had a system of this multi-level queue. Okay? And in true multi-level queue fashion, those jobs did not migrate from bucket to bucket because they were defined in a certain way. They stayed where they were. Okay? In a multi-level queue system, each bucket has its own scheduling method. This is how we get to the blending a little bit. So we're using priority sort of overall with the queues, the buckets themselves. But then we get to decide, okay, our high priority work, we're going to handle it first come, first serve. Okay? Our second queue, we're going to handle our second and third queues maybe the same way. And our fourth queue, our intangible work, the queue that's least important, we want to start making some progress so we can learn early things from each one. And maybe by the time we get to that, when we get to that, then sorry, I lost my train of thought. When we get to that, then they aren't as important, so it's okay if they take a little bit longer. And if we do little bits and pieces, we can learn something before we move on to the next. And we may change the importance of the jobs that are in that queue. This doesn't always work because of the situation where we talked about where you have your operating system updates, and they're sitting there in your fourth little queue, your intangible queue, the things that aren't really urgent right now. But if we take forever to get to that fourth queue, that fourth bucket of work, then it's going to become emergent. So that's where we've sort of evolved from to have another option. From the multi-level queue, we inject the concept of feedback. So initially, we put that operating system update job into our lowest priority queue, right? We know it's going to take a while, but if we take forever to get to it, it is going to migrate all the way up to the first most important queue. That's when it becomes emergent. When we start seeing that happen a lot, we have to reassess the priority of what we put in the fourth bucket. It causes some learning opportunities. And we need to figure out how we can avoid things having to move so drastically down from the fourth bucket up to the first bucket. Now, what I have on here are just examples of the scheduling methods that you can use in each bucket. Each one can be different, and it's your choice in how you decide to handle that. But again, these buckets are sort of like classes of service too. So if you're looking at a cost of delay model, which is a way that a lot of people are taught to think about this kind of system, then your buckets might be something like this. So the first bucket is expedite. That means the cost of, dropping everything else is less than the cost of not doing this thing right now. That's the breaking news stuff, right? The second queue might be your fixed state stuff. So not quite drop everything, but if it doesn't get done by this certain date, then we're going to either have stiff penalties or we're going to lose the opportunity to make money in the market. The third one might be just all the stuff, right? And hopefully this is where a lot of our stuff goes because we have a lot of options in this area. But it's if I do it right now, I'll get value right away. But there's no penalties if I don't do it right this second. And then that fourth is the stuff that can take a while. So we see most people using some type of multi-level feedback queue as how they organize their work. We consider this an evolved way to do it, right? It has a lot of overhead, but the complexity of what we work in, we feel like this is necessary. So when we are building our multi-level queue system, we have to think about a couple of things. How many queues do we need? Do we really need 4 queues? Maybe we just need 2, 3, So we have to decide how we're going to break apart those queues and how we're going to define the queues, okay? What each queue means. Then we have to decide the scheduling algorithm for each, okay? And again, sort of the sky's the limit on all the different ways that you could do that. You could create your own. And then you have to determine when to promote a job from a lower queue to a higher queue, when to demote a job from a higher queue to a lower queue, because that happens. Sometimes we think we think things are a priority and it's not the case. When I did some measuring of all of the expedite requests that I got when I worked on a large website that wasn't CNN, I found that our expedites had a lot of hurry up and waits. So it was easy for people to say, hey, this is an emergency, do it right now. But then the first time that you asked for some feedback, you didn't hear anything. It's crickets, right? It's happened to me quite a lot. So sometimes you need to demote things from a higher priority queue to a lower one. And which queue a process will enter when it needs service. So this begs the question, when I was researching all of this, I was thinking, okay, I want to know what my operating system uses, what yours might use. So you can see here that there are lots of multi-level feedback queues. So this is really common, okay? There's one that, I don't know, I am not a person that has ever written an operating system. So you people in this room know more about this than me, most likely. I've never been in a very technical role about working with an operating system. But this is really interesting to me. And even the ones that don't use multi-level feedback queues still have some preemptions. So this means systems that have some sort of context switching cost. So very rarely are we able to get away from all of that. So I just thought this was very interesting. There are a couple that we haven't covered and we won't cover. You can consider that your homework to go take a look if you want to know what the completely fair scheduler is and all of that. It's all very interesting. But we talked about one way to blend ideas together and make your scheduler, but you need to choose based on your context. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework of how to do that. Some guiding questions that you can use to make your own decisions, okay? And the first is to answer some key questions about what's important and make policies to optimize for those answers. So the first thing we have to think about is, does our work require any special treatment, okay? If not, again, use first come, first served. This has the least amount of overhead and should have the least amount of trouble if you truly don't have any special classes of work, okay? If you do have work that needs to be treated differently, then obviously you can use basic priority or you can move to multi-level queues. Now, the next question we need to ask is, are we worried about job starvation? If we decide to go with priority, are we concerned if the low priority work never gets done? Right? If you are, then you upgrade to something like a multi-level feedback queue system. And this is sort of what I explained before. But another thing that you can do also is add allocations to each queue. So you don't just have to let them be unfettered all the time, but you can say, in my work system, I really only want to have one emergency at a time going on. Now, that's not going to be possible up front if you have the fire, hose situation going on. But what it triggers us to do is start figuring out what would have to be true about my environment to only have one emergency going on at a time? To ask these questions, to figure out mitigation strategies, and improve ourselves to the point where we can say one emergency at a time. We only want to have a couple of fixed dates at a time, because if I accept too many things that are due on a specific date, then I have fewer options to move around, right? And if I have dependencies, one thing, one problem in one fixed date project can blow up all of the rest. Okay? So if I limit how many fixed date kinds of things I have, for instance, then that gives me more options. We want to then say, well, we have a lot of these things like maintenance, these things that never get any love, and we want to make sure they don't become emergent. So one of the most common ways that people do that is to give not a maximum allocation, but a minimum allocation to the intangible work or the lower priority work. So this is not a maximum of one intangible, it could be, but it's also a minimum of, let's keep one thing going on at all times to fill the space if we end up waiting on a dependency or something like that. We've got this thing going on, and we can always, put that on hold for a second, but if something else comes up, but we always are paying attention to the most important intangible thing. And then you fill the rest of your space with standard. Okay. Now, the last couple of questions to ask is, does partially done work provide you any value? Okay. And is our goal to keep people busy or deliver quickly? I think I heard someone chuckle, and, how many of you would say that the goal at your work is to keep people busy? It's not ever the goal, right? Very few people have a goal of saying, I want to design my system so that we're busy as possible. But how many of you, even if it's not your goal, how many of you feel like people are putting practices in place that keep you busy at the cost of delivering that value? Right? We've got some people experiencing that. So that's what's that's what we see a lot, is that we are taking all of these things that help us create process and help us manage all of the craziness, but the way that we manage it, the choices we make, we don't understand the consequences of that. So all of the things that we're doing to try to help ourselves end up being the very things that cause us never to finish any work, because we inject a lot of this context switching. So if you don't get any value of just keeping yourself busy and partially done work isn't providing you any value, then you can either discard the concept of a round robin, or modify it a little bit and say, I'm not switching in the middle of a job, but I might say, I'm going to do one thing from this bucket, then one thing from that bucket, then one thing from the other bucket. If you have multiple stakeholders and you're not getting them to prioritize all together, you can say, well, I'm going to do one for you, one for you, one for you, and one for you. Or you could use that allocation model again, where you're saying each stakeholder depending on, who knows, maybe the budget that they're providing to your organization. Each one of you will get an allocation of our actual overall capacity. One of the best ways to make sure that we're actually finishing work, avoiding the partially done value, is to limit how many things we're doing at one time. A Kanban system is really valuable in doing this. And you don't have to change all of the ways you work to add the concept of work in process limits in your organization. It doesn't matter if you use Scrum and you're working in iterations, fine. Add a work in process limit to that iteration so you're finishing things faster, even in that 2-week sprint. Okay. I get this argument a lot that, well, if I am in a place where there's lots of emergent things, how can I possibly have a work in process limit, right? But just because there are lots of things that are emergencies doesn't mean you're capable of doing more than X number of things at one time. Okay. Even an ambulance has a WIP limit. There are only certain numbers of people that can fit into an ambulance. There has to be a decision made at some point about priority, and we have to realize our actual capacity and stick to just that. Now, beyond scheduling, there are some other decisions that we can make to help us make good choices and deliver value instead of staying busy. And the first thing is, if we spent more time deciding what we aren't going to do ahead of all of this, we could maybe not even have some of these conversations, right? Because I like the quote by Drucker, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should never be done at all. But we spend a lot of time working on being really efficient at a bunch of junk because no one sits back and says, we should say no to that and no to the other thing. Okay, so that's something that we really want to do. Agile has it right. Scrum has it right when they're talking about working in small bits. Okay, if we had smaller things to do, if we were really looking at how could I deliver early value, then things would not take extremely long. People wouldn't be getting quite antsy. There would be less pressure to preempt the jobs that are already in place, which that preemption causes the management overhead, and all of that begins that vicious cycle. So if we can think about working in small chunks, we're going to alleviate a lot of the issues that we might have otherwise. So I worked at LeanKit before I started working for myself. And this was the sort of culture, the directive of how we should work at LeanKit. We called it FizGood. And we would look at a piece of work and say, that doesn't feel very FizGood, right? So we wanted to see if we're delivering frequently. To do that, we needed to do small things. Those small things needed to be good. Now we'll get back to that. But in order to be frequent, small, they had to be decoupled from each other. Right? If we have a highly coupled environment, a tightly coupled environment, then it's really hard to move frequently. The biggest issue in this was the definition of good. So I don't have an answer for you for this moment for that. You'll have to talk about what good might be. But think about what your directive for how your organization should work is. And if you don't have one, you can adopt FizGood and take that with you. Okay. So once you have decided how you want to work as a team, as an organization, then you have to think about, too, when to break the rules or when to even redefine the rules in the first place. So if you say, we are going to work this way, here's how we're going to manage our work in a normal environment. Well, what happens when we have an emergency? Are you going to does your system allow for that? Do you know in advance how you're going to respond when you have something unexpected? Talking about that, thinking about that ahead of time is going to save you a lot of trouble when things like that are going on. Okay? And I want to always remember this question. How can we get to the part where we're moving so quickly that even prioritization is less of an urge because things are delivering quickly and we don't leave people long enough so that they can get antsy and put fake due dates on things just because they know a due date triggers something getting in a higher queue and getting done. So how can we move faster? How can we be phys good so that we can say, let's take a simpler way of managing our work? So if we start out with something super complex because our world is chaotic and we make a heavy management overhead type of scheduler for that, as you're improving, as you're making things better, frequently ask yourself, or at least at a cadence, okay, did we improve enough where we can reduce the process that we have until we get to a minimally necessary set of processes to do our work? So once you've determined your scheduling policies, especially if you're in a place where you're going to have multiple things going on at once, or you have the opportunity for preemption happening, which means, you've started a piece of work and something might come in and interrupt it, then you're going to have to think about process synchronization. Okay? So by choosing a scheduling method, we've already given thought to work in process limits, okay, or how much you'll do at one time. We want to get to thinking about the other things that we can do to make the fact that we've got lots of things going on a little bit more palatable. The biggest issue with our environments right now, as far as getting things done from a flow perspective, as a person who walks into organizations and helps them understand and see what's getting in the way of them finishing work, one of the biggest issues that we have when dealing with all of the synchronization is dependencies. So dependencies in this metaphor would be our deadlocks, right? We get stuck on something here, we have to lock this thing down, wait till this other thing finishes, and then this job can start again. Okay? So if we can have more independent processes that are less subject to dependencies or not subject to dependencies at all, we're having a better situation. But more often we have the cooperative processes that we're working with other people, relying on other people, and they have to get done. So I wanted to share a little bit about the impact of dependencies. There's a lot visual going on up here, so I'm going to walk through that with you. Okay? So if you're waiting on something to be done, you know that it's already you have to put your work away and you have to wait before you can start that again. But did you know that every dependency that you introduce doubles the chance that you'll deliver late? Okay? That's sad, right? Because we know how many dependencies we have. But the flip side, the good thing about that is that each dependency we remove doubles the chance that we will deliver on time. So there's a happy and sad way to look at that, just from the flip standpoint. So what we have here in that big table on the right is, think about it like this. If you are going to a restaurant and that restaurant will not seat you till all your party is there, and there are 4 people in your party, okay? These are each line on that table is a possibility of who gets there on time. Okay? Only one row is the possibility where everyone gets there on time. We have a 1 in 16 chance of, starting our project on time, which is dinner, when we have 4 dependencies. So if we add a 5th dependency, then we have a 1 in 32 chance. If we remove one and say, okay, we're only going to take 3 people to dinner, then that's a 1 in 8 chance. Okay? How many of you out there work in a very highly dependent environment? Everyone, right? Do you feel like on a normal project or normal thing that you try to do, no matter what scale it is, hold your fingers up for how many dependencies you normally have to get something done? Is it 2? Is it 4? I see 10. Okay, so You're starting to understand what your odds are of getting something done on time based on the number of dependencies you have. So when you start to calculate your own odds, that picture gets a little scary, right? But it's good because we can see the reality. So now if you know that if I have 4 dependencies, that means a 1 in 16 chance, you'll go and you'll say, hey boss, hey stakeholder, I'm sorry, there's a 1 in 14 chance we'll deliver, or 1 in 16 chance we're going to deliver your thing on time. They might be motivated to do something about it. So we need to try to find ways to make our work a little less dependent on each other. One of the things that we can do to combat that is cross-training. Making T-shaped people, we heard that earlier. I love the way he explained it. We know a bit about a lot and a lot about a bit. That's great. That means I've got expertise, deep expertise in an area, and then I've got superficial expertise, superficial knowledge in a lot of other areas. So it makes the shape of a T if this were my knowledge. Okay. So what we want to do is we have a lot of people that are just, an L, where there's no top of that T. We want to expand that a little bit so we're not always reliant on specialists. This is an example that you can tell this is from my early days. So this is about 2009, I think, on my team for a website. And every person on my team is listed on this board. And every quarter we updated the board. I think it was quarter. Yeah, every quarter we updated the board. And we said, what's the primary thing you're learning? Everyone was responsible for learning something. Okay? And then there sometimes was a secondary thing. Here's the thing, though. We think a lot about the impact of the person who's learning and the time it will take. But if we really, truly want to grow the skills in our organization, we have to understand that if we're relying on other people in the organization, the other specialists, to help teach the people that are learning, there's going to be an impact from them as well. So we had people who were responsible for learning, and then for each specialist, they were responsible for helping someone learn. Now, the caveat is that me as the manager, I had to treat that like real work. There are no free rides. There's no extra magic time that appears when someone's learning. So if I don't allow anyone to have time at work to do the learning, to do the teaching, then I'm not really allowing people to learn and improve their skills. So we can ask people to do this, but you have to ask for, or if you're a manager, you have to give time and space and make it a priority for people to learn. Learning is one of those jobs that you're doing that you have to schedule with everything else. Another way to think about it is do whatever you can to make focus a priority so that we can do fewer preemptions. We spend less time context switching. So one way that I had like 8 people in my team, that same team. And I was one of those people that said, we can never just focus on one project at a time. My team was like probably many of your teams, where we had projects going on, we had day-to-day operational work of the website. We were responsible for the whole content on the website. So what would happen is that we would be playing these percentage games, where John is going to be working 25% on this project, 25% on that project, 30% on the other project, and then 20% on everything else. Okay? I don't know about you, but as a developer, when I was a developer, even now when I'm a consultant or a manager, I don't have a clock that says, 30% of my day's up, switching to this other thing now. It never really works out the way that we're pretending. We're telling ourselves a story that we really want to believe, but isn't really true. It's a fiction story, right? So we want to get away from fictional things. So I was in this Agile class, and I said out loud, that will never work here, right? And so for a long time, I still thought that. And then I said, okay, we're going to give it a try. I only had like 8 people, and we still had a lot of specialty. So what I did was I said, okay, we had a lot of tentpole-driven events, too. There was an event, the season start of a particular sport. That's not going to move, right? We had to do that project. So I'd say, okay, I'm going to look at what this project needs, and I'm going to pull the right skill set out of the pool. We looked at our team as a pool, and we said, okay, these people are going to be dedicated to this project. They're going to focus on this project, okay? And then everyone else is going to do the day-to-day stuff. And if we needed to spin up another project, then we'd look at the remaining people in the pool and say, well, here's what we've got, and we'll pull these people out. And there were times where I had one person left in the pool to do all of the other stuff. That helped us learn the consequence of our choices. It helped our organization, our stakeholders, learn how much an individual person could actually accomplish, what capacity they had. And over time, they said that that was one of the best choices they had ever made, because they saw when there's chaotic environments going on and you're saying yes to everything and you're trying to do all of the things, it's really difficult to understand capacity. When you try to allow for focus in any way, whether it's this way or a different way, you truly start to see the actual capacity of the people in your organization. And once you understand your budget, you can start living within your means at work and trying to build a scheduler that respects that capacity, respects that budget. And then if the stakeholders can see it as well, they're less likely to try to extend your credit by forcing more things in at once. So what I liked about this is that as much as I'd like to say we had hard boxes around these dedicated people, that's not true either, right? Because there were rare specialties in my team. And so while a specialist person was primarily focused on one thing, sometimes they had to be a little flexible and flow through another project. Now, this causes its own sort of preemption issues and things like that. So I had to do things like the cross-training to combat the need for specialties so that those people only have to pull when they're, when it's absolutely necessary. If you really want to maintain a specialty and you want this person to just focus on this and be the person that is reliant on, if you want Brent to stay Brent, then Brent needs to have slack time. You can't fully commit Brent 100% of the time because Brent will be overcommitted at that point. You have to allow Brent to be able to just wait, because only then can he immediately react when an emergency comes up, when you need him. So you have to make a choice. Cross-train people so more people can do more of the things, or allow slack, or both, which is even better, some combination of the two. Okay, so the key takeaways here are to just look around. Look around at your environment, see how things operate. Sometimes when you're stepping out of your headspace and you start to look at different things, you get ideas of, oh, I didn't really think of it that way. How can I pull that in to what we do? So just look around you. Start opening your mind, seeing if you can pull things. Then use the simplest method possible, because that introduces the least overhead. Know the risks of every method you use. You're going to have to make trade-offs. Make those trade-offs, understand what they are, understand the consequences of those. Have discussions about that. Now, the next thing, if you know me, you know I never say best practice. This is the first time in a long time I've said best practice. I thought about it. I was like, I'm having a really hard time right now thinking of any time in which working small is not going to help us. So maybe you can help enlighten me. So for right now, I'm saying working small is a best practice. We should all think about how we could work smaller. Remove dependencies wherever possible, and then make focus a focus. And do that at multiple levels. Don't just say, I threw some WIP limits on there, so we're focusing now. We've got the focus, check. There's focus at that level. There's focus at a portfolio level. How many things are we going to allow to happen at once? If I only look at one level, what happens is it can look like, from what I see in my visual sphere, that this can happen. I'll give you an example. There's an F5 booth out here. I used to work for F5 a few years ago in Seattle. And I seem to always have 8-person teams. We had an 8-person team there. And again, we would have multiple projects going on at once. We looked at it and we said, on paper, we should be able to do 4 projects at once. Because we need these 2 people, these 2, that makes 8. 2 times 4 is 8. It's fine. And even if we tried to map out every single thing and all the math looked good, we came to a realization, looking at a higher level, that when we had more than 2 projects going on at once, our deadlines slipped. So we not only were managing our focus on a day-to-day level, but we had to step back and manage a higher level focus on the portfolio and find other ways to manage focus. So I wanted to open it up now. We have a few minutes for any questions, or if you have comments, I'm very happy to hear those. I'm going to leave this slide up, though. If you have any questions or want to contact me, you can do that via all of these methods. And the slides are up on SpeakerDeck. So if you would like to download these or any others, that's the URL. And thank you very much.